If we can say anything about President Trump to this point, it's that he has utterly and completely failed to impose his will on his own administration. Now, what do I mean by that? This is the man that said that he was going to make some phone calls and would end all of this in 24 hours. Well, we found out, and he's found out, that sloganeering and posturing is not a strategy. Sorry, President Trump, but promising to call somebody is not a strategy. He has no strategy. And at this point, he's lost all credibility because in his discussions with Putin on the phone or discussions between his representatives and the Russians and Saudi Arabia have all come to nothing. These promises of a normalization in relations between the two countries and a restoration of some measure of civility in our relations, all of these have come to naught. Yet those are things that President Trump said he wanted. Those are things that President Trump said he supports. So what's gone wrong? Well, nobody pays any attention to President Trump inside his own administration. He's surrounded by people who have their own agendas, and I'm sure that they pacify him, but they're scurrying off in whatever direction they think is appropriate. And it may be that in their minds they're trying to implement what he wants, but the truth is that there is no executive competence. In other words, there's no way, no method to do any of the things that President Trump talked about. He just can't do it. You know, and this is not news to President Putin. President Putin has pointed out on numerous occasions, I've dealt with several presidents in my lifetime. Remember, he's been there for 25 years, and he discovered something. Whatever the presidents wanted to do didn't happen because the federal bureaucracy, the other members of the federal government, the Senate and the House, they're the ones that are ultimately driving policy. And you have the same thing in the Middle East. It doesn't really make any difference what President Trump says because Mr. Netanyahu can sit there and say, I control 60 senators, no matter what happens. How many senators do you control, Mr. Trump? And the answer is, well, not very many. And right now you have a similar situation with regard to Ukraine. Do you really think these two senators, Blumenthal and Graham, would have trooped off to Ukraine to make this PR stunt more meaningful to the West if they thought they were under a president who was prepared to do anything? Let me tell you something. The president of the United States is potentially a very powerful figure. He can make life miserable for any number of senators or representatives who absolutely refuse to cooperate with him. And thus far, the only name that comes up that's being mentioned as someone that President Trump doesn't like and wants to punish is Thomas Massie of Kentucky. Because Massie won't vote for the stupid bills. He won't vote for the big, beautiful bill that promises to destroy us financially, as Elon Musk rightly pointed out. And he refuses to vote for legislation that creates a special class of human beings in the United States. This is the bill that makes Jews special citizens and makes anyone who criticizes Israel an enemy of the state. He said this is outrageous nonsense. So that's the one the president is going after. Now, this is very strange stuff because I inevitably go back and try to understand what presidents did in the past. And I inevitably end up with Eisenhower because he seems to have been one of the more forthright, clear-thinking individuals. And I go back to the Suez Crisis of '56 and how quickly and decisively he acted because the one thing he did not want and would do everything in his power to prevent was a war with the Soviet Union. And he made that abundantly clear to London and Paris, and in those days to Tel Aviv. He wasn't going to underwrite or support any territorial aggrandizement of Israel. He wasn't going to tolerate the restoration of British imperialism in Africa. And he said the same thing to the French. Now, where is President Trump? You know, from the beginning, I said, fixing this is impossible. We don't understand the complexities at work in the Ukraine-Russian war. He's right. He wasn't there at the beginning. He's been systematically fed utter nonsense about it. He doesn't understand it. And the one thing that he can do to bring this to an end quickly, because he says that's what he wants to do, is to suspend all further aid to Ukraine and withdraw all U.S. forces. That's something he could do and say, Europeans, this is your show. It's up to you. Sit down with the Ukrainians and the Russians and sort this out. We're Americans. We've done all we're going to do. It hasn't worked. We're leaving. That would have worked had he done it early on, very, very well. Now he's in a very different position. No one believes anything he says. He's not taken seriously on any subject. And that's happening here at home as well. We could go through a whole list of domestic issues right now where this is occurring. But my point is, he could still do what I said, and that would probably avoid a conflict with Russia. But the situation we have now is one where the Russians are probably now compelled to act decisively in some way. The good news for us is that President Putin is not emotional. He tries to be as dispassionate as he can be about these matters. And whatever they do will probably be deliberate, measured, and decisive. But I think they're reaching the point now where they know that they've got to move decisively in a direction. I think that direction is to permanently remove the Zelensky regime. You can only do that by moving across the river and into Kiev. Perhaps that's coming. He has declined to do that sort of thing because he knows that we are irrational and the Europeans are irrational. We are emotional. We are impulsive. And his concern is, well, the next thing I know, they'll want to commit forces, and that'll mean air forces because there's nobody going to put any ground forces down in Ukraine these days. We're going to commit our air forces in support of the Ukrainians. Well, if that happens, all bets are off. Now you're at war with Russia, and not just Russia, potentially China as well, and a host of other countries. We don't realize how many people have come down on Russia's side at this point. We still have lots of Americans say, well, everyone important is against Russia. Depends on how you define important.
Important, yeah.
So the bottom line is this is a terrible situation. The Russians don't want to have a war with us or NATO or anybody else. They really do want this to end. But we are driving them into a position from which they can't easily escape. They've got to end it.
Well, and to your point here, literally just a couple of hours ago, Dmitry Medvedev put out a Telegram post here that addresses both the negotiations as well as those who are saying, hey, Russia hasn't done anything yet. They haven't responded to this strike on their bombers. Maybe they're not going to. Maybe they're afraid or whatever. And so he writes, to all who are worried and waiting for retribution, you need to worry. This is a normal person's quality. Retribution is inevitable. It is important to remember two things. He says, our army is active, advancing, and will continue to advance. Everything that must explode will certainly explode, and those who must be exterminated will disappear. Then number two, he says the negotiations in Istanbul are needed not for a compromised peace or unrealistic conditions invented by someone, but for our speedy victory and the complete destruction of the neo-Nazi government, i.e., to your point you just made. This is the meaning of the Russian memorandum, which was published yesterday. So he flat out says, hey, this is not about, having a negotiated settlement where both sides get give and take. If I said those 12 points look like an issue and an instrument of surrender, apparently to the Dmitry Medvedev and presumably by extension Putin, that's exactly what he intends. What does that tell you about what may be coming next?
Well, I'd hesitate to forecast because, the Russians always do what you don't expect. At the beginning of the war in February 2022, I was very convinced that they would mobilize large forces and they would strike very decisively. The opposite happened. But I do know that they have now added enormous numbers of troops to the contingent in Ukraine, as well as to the position in Belarus to the north. I don't think there's much that the Russians cannot do if they decide to do it. But again, if they do, they will take all the precautions against the possibility that we would be foolish enough to suddenly commit our air power in support of the Ukrainians. And if people out there don't think that we would do that, they need to guess again. And again, we go back to President Trump. Where is President Trump on this matter? Is he like Eisenhower? Has he made it abundantly clear that under no circumstances will he support a war against Russia? I haven't heard him say that, but that is something he needs to say. He needs to be, unequivocal about our unwillingness to directly intervene militarily in Ukraine. Has he said that? No, he hasn't. So it's
He
a
has.
dangerous set of circumstances.
And there are those in Europe that not only are not saying that same thing, they seem to be implying they're giving some consideration to move it in that direction. Yesterday, Mark Rutte, who was also at that Vilnius meeting, was speaking to reporters and said a couple of very interesting things. Here, this first one is he's talking about how NATO is still preparing and growing, he says, for war.
We will discuss Ukraine in The Hague, and also today making sure that Ukraine has what it needs to stay in the fight, to be able to bring this terrible Russian war of aggression against Ukraine to an end, which has to be lasting, which has to be durable. So all of this will be on the agenda today.
I mean, basically, Doug, he's saying that, he's talking like the Ukraine side is winning and they plan on winning this war. And then we're going to see in a minute that they're talking about building up forces within NATO. But at the same time, this was also being reported that the NATO is saying, hey, we're going to invite Zelensky to the next meeting at The Hague, the NATO summit that's coming up in The Hague here in a little while. And you're like, what? Everybody, to include Trump, has categorically said there's not going to be any Ukraine in NATO now or ever. Kellogg actually went overboard to emphasize that. And yet here NATO is saying they're going to invite him anyway. I don't understand the play here.
Well, none of us do. Two things to consider. First is that President Trump is the de facto leader of NATO, not Rutte. If Trump is serious about avoiding a war with Russia, he needs to pick up the phone and tell Mr. Rutte, thank you for your interest in national security affairs. You are hereby fired, and replace him with someone else who's going to accurately represent the president's views. Again, this is a matter of imposing your will. Did the British complain when we intervened, when Eisenhower intervened and said no to Suez? Of course they did. Were the French upset over it? Of course they were. But they all got the hell out and they did what he told them to do. I think that President Trump is going to have to become involved and exert some influence and show some leadership. You know, that's the first thing. The second part of this is that I would remind Mr. Rutte and his friends meeting in Vilnius that Vilnius in 1812 was the place where the final meeting between Napoleon Bonaparte's representatives and Tsar Alexander I occurred. We all know how that turned out. Alexander I said, no, I'm not going to do what you're demanding. And so Bonaparte marched some 600,000 plus men into Russia, of whom only about 50,000 managed to crawl back out again in 1813. So it's not a good place to hold a meeting in view of that historical backdrop. And I see no evidence that anything that Mr. Rutte is saying is going to move the Russians an inch, because for them, what happens in Ukraine is an existential issue. That's the thing we have never understood and are unwilling to understand. What happens in that country is of vital strategic importance to Moscow. Ergo, they will do whatever is required to ultimately ensure that their country is protected and will not be subject to future attacks, as it has been over the last several years by Kiev.
Yeah, and we'll see where that's going to go. And what is not going to be helping in that direction is something else that's going on in NATO. And before I get to this next soundbite here from Rutte, where he's talking about that, I'd like your view on something that one of our longtime guests on this, or not guest, but a longtime follower of our show was going back and forth with me earlier today. And I was commenting on the fact that, I was surprised that Russia hasn't, done things. For example, we had Jim Jatras on the show yesterday, and he said he was puzzled why Russia never had gone heavy. Like you mentioned, you thought they would come heavy and earlier, or why they haven't knocked out the bridges over the Dnieper, which would nearly starve the Ukraine forces in the east. And this fellow posits that, well, because Russia can and they haven't, because it's basically emptying the coffers of NATO. It's making NATO weaker and weaker by lowering the amount of ammunition they have, because they don't have enough industrial capacity to replace the losses. So the more stuff they give to Ukraine, the lower their arsenals get, and the stronger the balance of power between NATO and Russia continues to go on Russia's side. First of all, I just want your view on how much credibility to that you give.
Well, the second point is worth addressing. Attrition can work in your favor. I think, frankly, it has worked in Russia's favor to this point. But attrition is dangerous because inevitably you too have to give up opportunities. You have to sacrifice resources and manpower in order to pursue your aims in a war of attrition. Even if you win, it's still a very costly proposition. Now, the good news for the Russians is that their economy has grown brilliantly during the last several years. I mean, this is one of the really absurd things that you hear all the time. We're here to hurt Russia and Russia's hurting. Well, you may have shown up to hurt Russia, but contrary to popular belief, Russia really isn't hurting. I would argue that we're hurting here at home economically, and I would say the same thing is true in Europe. But you know, I wouldn't hang my hat entirely on the attrition argument, and I'm not sure that, as satisfying as it may be to see Ukrainians who are not trained fall in on NATO equipment and be destroyed, that is necessarily a long-term strategic goal. I think that goal's already been achieved. I think the objective now is really to bring the fighting to an end. The question is, what's the best way to do that? And I think that's occupying. Now, as far as the bridges go, it always struck me that you should restrict the numbers of bridges across the river. You don't need to bring them all down because at some point you may want to use them for offensive operations. So if I were sitting on the general staff, I would pick some number of those bridges that have both rail and ground traffic on them. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, I don't know. And then I would point out that we can target whatever masses at either end of the bridge, which means that everyone is canalized now. They can't cross at all these various bridges. But there are some bridges they can still use. And then you can decide whether or not you want to kill everybody that just came across or destroy everybody before they start. But I wouldn't have damaged or destroyed all the bridges. And that's just from a purely military standpoint. And I don't know what the discussion was like in the Russian general staff.